Let's start with Nick, who's sitting, he won't mind me, who's sitting on my right. Do you need these?
I do, thank you. I need to load my talk up, don't I? So, I just want to show those two photos. I don't know if anyone saw the world's press photography competition the other day in London. It was magnificent. The one on the right is a poor lady holding her dead niece in Gaza, and that won first prize. The bottom picture is someone walking through Khan Yunis, which is a city I know very well. My Gazan friends over there know very well in this destroyed city. That was the runner-up prize. I'm going to start off by giving you a CNN quote of the day from March the 22nd. I was in the US at the time doing some advocacy for Gaza. I spent time at the United Nations and in DC with some politicians. And I was with Dr. Thea Ahmad, who's a good friend of mine. He's an emergency physician in Chicago. And he'd been out in Gaza at the same time as me over Christmas and New Year. And we both did a lot of media interviews out there. And he was interviewed by CNN. And they used his answer to their first question as their quote of the day. And he was asked, what is it like in Gaza at the moment? And his answer was, it is apocalyptic, it was horrific, it was miserable. And that really sums up what is going on in Gaza at the moment. I'm going to talk about normal Gaza to start with, because I want you to understand what Gaza was like before October the 7th. I say normal because it became normal to me. It became normal to all my Gazan friends and relatives over there, but it's not normal by anyone else's standards at all. It's very small Gaza, it's 25 miles long. There used to be a Gaza marathon, which I think was last run 15 years ago, 20 years ago, I don't know. I know someone who ran it once, but it's only 360 square kilometres. It's extremely densely populated, more than 2.2 million people, high unemployment, and a median age of 17, which means half the population of children, which perhaps helps you understand why nearly over 40 or begins to understand why 14,000 children have been killed in the last 7 months. High poverty has, of course, been occupied by Israel since 1967 and has been blockaded for the last 16 years, and it's been variously called the large prison and concentration camp. Now, the healthcare services, the provision of healthcare has always been very challenging in Gaza for many reasons, and there have been many reasons why there's been poor health in Gaza. And I'm going to talk about social and medical reasons. Of course, we're going to talk about the impact of violent conflict. But it's very important to recognise that the World Health Organization definition of health for nations, an essential criterion for that is human security. And of course, that is something that has not existed for Palestinians for many years. So they're right from the word go, they're going to struggle to be a healthy population. So what are the social determinants? Well, the borders are closed, the economy has been largely disabled by Israeli control for many years. It's an occupation under military control, extreme poverty, extreme unemployment, we've heard about that already, continuing food insecurity. I'm going to talk quite a bit about the effects of malnutrition, which I think is a huge danger and a huge cause of death at the moment in Gaza. But before October the 7th, there's always been food insecurity there. Poor water availability, quality, very poor sanitation often, inability to travel, and real energy and fuel insecurity with recurrent power cuts to the extent that often, again, we're talking about normal Gaza, pre-October the 7th, often electricity only for 3-4 days at a time. What about medical strains on their healthcare system? A chronic shortage of drugs, medicines, surgical disposables, surgical instruments. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the work I've done there previously operating out there in normal Gaza, which again is still very challenging. Malnutrition, we keep coming back to that. Inadequate capacity, both in terms of personnel, healthcare workers, and infrastructure. Outdated medical equipment, denial of treatment referrals. There's a continuing need for Gazans to be able to leave Gaza for medical care. For example, I'm a cancer surgeon. For example, there's no radiotherapy facilities in Gaza at all. So if someone needs radiotherapy, they have to leave, or they have to apply for permission to leave. And then they go to the West Bank, then they go to Jordan. So 33% of requests for medical transfer out are denied by the Israeli government. We're talking about before October the 7th. And even if they're allowed to go out, 62% of requests for companions to go with them are denied. And that means children may well go to the West Bank for radiotherapy for their brain tumour without any parents going out, without anyone going with. So this is again before October the 7th. Lack of specialists, great difficulty for anyone to get out and train, and great difficulty for people to go in and train them. And of course, multiple disabilities made much, much worse by the deliberate targeting of Gazan youth limbs during the Grand March to Return since 2018. The deliberate targeting of the legs, the kneecaps, to destroy their legs, to make them disabled. Now, the healthcare challenges in Gaza is not new. This was an emergency statement released by MAP in 2018, saying that the total collapse of Gaza healthcare was imminent at that stage. So this has been a recurring theme for many, many years, but of course is extreme at the moment. I mentioned Islamic University Gaza. I've been going out since 2010. This is me and a bunch of colleagues from Oxford who ENAS over there will recognise. And we go out, I take out a team of surgeons, obstetricians, paediatricians, physicians, and we teach medical students. We have done since 2010. We teach them at the bedside how to examine patients, how to develop clinical skills. We have a whole system of case scenario stations where we teach them resuscitation of critically ill, basic surgical skills. And we've been doing that yearly since 2010. Separate to that, I've also been going out with medical aid for Palestinians. I'm going to plug MAP throughout this talk, and I'm going to show you the QR code after this, so you can photograph it and donate money to them, because they're a wonderful, wonderful charity. But I've been going out with MAP to help develop their cancer surgical services over recent years, to carry out major stomach cancer surgery, to help develop advanced keyhole or laparoscopic surgery, and to organise their cancer services. October the 14th, we had set up, it was cancelled for obvious reasons, we had arranged our first online multidisciplinary team meeting for upper GI cancer between Oxford, London and Gaza. We were going to discuss all their cancer patients, and then we were going out 10 days later for a week of cancer surgery. October 21st, it didn't happen. They've actually embraced real advances in cancer treatment in Gaza in the last few years, which have been destroyed now. They've just built a standalone cancer hospital, the Turkish hospital, just for cancer treatment. That's a massive move forward. It's of course being destroyed. This was normal Gaza that we're all used to. And this is me on the left there with Sarah Al-Sakra, a wonderful young doctor who was the first female ever to qualify as a surgeon in Gaza. And that's me operating last May, almost a year ago to the day, wondering how I'm going to do this operation with very few instruments, with it's very challenging operating out there. So that really is northern Gaza. It is normal Gaza. It's a beautiful country. It's got a beautiful coastline. They're a very happy, very, very beautiful people. Every single new doctor I've taken out there since 2010 has fallen in love with the place and wants to go back. I've got a queue of about 30 people who want to join our teams now. I have to keep saying no to them. It's a beautiful country. Top right, it might seem inappropriate showing a Gazan feast at a time when there is a famine in Gaza, but my Gazan friends, my Gazan colleagues and my Gazan family over there want people to understand what normal Gaza is like. Enas is sitting over there. Enas is our Gazan daughter, we call her. She's part of our family, and her husband Rami and daughter Sama. That's her family there. And that's us, the Oxford group, having an enormous feast. Every time I go to Gaza, my wife tells me off when I get back, because I come back overweight, or more overweight, shall I say. So Gaza is a beautiful place. But then, of course, we get to October the 7th, and at that stage, just to remind you, the health service was already stretched, already infrastructure problems, zero stock. So they kept running out of stuff. They never had any spare stock at all. We talked about the treatment referrals. 43% of women of childbearing age were malnourished in Gaza, much worse now. 30% of children were anemic. Multiple disabilities. I haven't talked about psychological, mental health problems. Imagine the amount of traumatic stress out there. In 2014, after Operation Protective Edge, 2,000 civilians were killed in Gaza. That's been dwarfed by now. After that, they estimated 450,000 children in Gaza needed psychological. Imagine what it's going to be like now. And of course, we've talked about the polluted water. And then the appalling events of October the 7th happened, and Gaza has been changed irrevocably since then. Now, I'm not going to bore you with lots of figures, but I'm just going to give, and you probably know these figures. These are from the UN website, OCHA website, day 238 a few days ago. Death toll of people killed by trauma, by bombs, by gunshots is 36,284. I believe, many believe, almost certainly a gross underestimate, but that's the figure they put out there. 82,000 injured. Look at this. I'm going to talk a lot about the direct targeting of healthcare today, because there is incontrovertible evidence that is happening, and I'm going to present some of that evidence. More than 500 healthcare workers killed in the line of duty. More than 250 healthcare workers abducted and tortured, and I'm going to talk more about that, because we have evidence for that. Multiple hospital bombs. Less than 5 of the 36 hospitals partially functional. I think that's an overestimate. I think there's probably one hospital now which is functioning as anything above a sort of very, very basic level, and that's Al-Aqsa Hospital. Many, many thousands awaiting medical evacuation. There were a steady stream going out. That stopped completely since May the 6th, and a complete collapse of the healthcare system. I'm going to talk about excess deaths later, but I want to talk about a few individuals, and I apologise to Enas because I know this is very upsetting, but this is a very close friend of Enas. That's our kitchen table. That's my wife sitting there. She's sitting in the front row here. You can see Enas in the far corner, and the rest of my family. Next to Enas is my Sarah. My Sarah was a young doctor. He was a medical student from Gaza who I taught many years ago. He got a scholarship, a Chevenix scholarship, like Enas, to get out and train in the United Kingdom. He came to King's Hospital in London, and he then went back to Gaza to work for Médecins du Monde. He was killed on November the 7th or 8th, I think it was. The Israeli army, the Israeli Air Force, bombed his house. They killed my Sarah, they killed his parents, they killed his sisters. His wife happened to be out at the time, they just got married. His brothers were out at the time. His brothers came back and spent 2 days, 2 whole days, night and day, searching the rubble for their family's bodies, and they couldn't find them. After 2 days, another Israeli warplane bombed them and killed them. Now, top right-hand corner is Khaled, who works for Medical Aid for Palestinians in Gaza. He's one of a truly, truly inspirational group of people who I've known for years, who look after people like me when we go out there to help. They are a unique group of people, and Khaled is one of them. He was my Sarah's best friend in Gaza, and he told me about a conversation he had with Khaled a week before my Sarah was murdered. Khaled was sitting down with my Sarah. My Sarah told him he expected to die. They all expect to die out there. I've heard that so many times. They all think they will die, that they will be killed. My Sarah said to Khaled, I'm not frightened of dying. I know I'm going to die in this war. But what I'm frightened about is being bombed and being buried under the rubble, so I cannot have a proper religious burial. So Khaled was telling me with tears streaming down his face. That was beginning of November. My Sarah's still buried under the rubble. He still hasn't had a proper burial. And that tears people apart, as you can imagine. And this is one of many, many, many other people. And that's why that figure of 36,000 people, undoubtedly, in my view, is an underestimate. Let's talk about children. We know half the population of Gaza is children. This was about 2 months old. So we know that over 14,500 children have been killed. So, but I've seen a lot of children who died when I was out there, and I'll talk a bit about it later. That is more children that have been killed in every other conflict in the world in the last 5 years. Just think about that. Now look at this statistic. This was published in November, okay? And at that point, there were 136 children being killed every single day in Gaza. Now, I've worked out the killing rate has gone down and it's averaged out at 70 children every single day have been killed in Gaza since October the 7th. Look at that graph. In Ukraine, the other war going on at the moment, 0.7 children killed per day. We can't compare conflicts, can we? But I'm going to for this sake. In Ukraine, 0.7 children killed per day. In Iraq, 0.6. Afghanistan, 2. Syria, 3 children killed per day on average. In Gaza, it's 70 children per day. There's an acronym in Gaza, which I've used in Al-Aqsa Hospital. We've all used WCNSF. Wounded child, no surviving children. Multiple thousands upon thousands of orphans out there. Over 1,500 children have had traumatic amputation. The killing rate of civilians in Gaza is 15 times higher than it is in Ukraine. But we do not hear that, do we? So I meant to say at the beginning of this talk, I was going to give a health warning on some things in this talk, and I'm not going to apologise, but I'm just going to give you a warning. Some harrowing stories and some fairly gruesome pictures. So I don't apologise, but I'll give you a warning. But I deliberately want to talk about this because I think it's something that you all need to know that's not being talked about properly in the media. So this was an awful day in Al-Aqsa Hospital when I was working there at the beginning of January, and I'm going to talk about Ala and Aya. You can see me at the top of there treating Ala, who's a little 6-year-old boy. This is the resuscitation room of Al-Aqsa Hospital. This was the day when there were multiple bombs on Nusrat camp and El Baraj camp, and we had far too many people coming in for us to cope with. The triage process, any of you who are medics or know, triage is the prioritisation process for working out who to treat first. The triage process had collapsed, and it does collapse when you've got a handful of doctors and dozens upon dozens of desperately sick people coming in. And I discovered little Ala, 6-year-old boy, lying on the floor of the waiting area of the hospital, not having been triaged, not having been seen by anyone. And I saw immediately he was in extremis, he had terrible burns. The first thing I saw was a big hole in his chest with an open chest wound with air being sucked in and out. That is a rapidly fatal condition unless treated. He had terrible burns. We bundled up, went into the resuscitation room. There was only one trolley there. 80% of the patients we treated in the ER were on the floor because there were no trolleys. That child lying on the floor with a bandage around his head had been lying on that single trolley. We had to put him on the floor. He's on a ventilator. He's got a catastrophic fatal head injury from which he hasn't yet died. Untreatable, no chance of survival, dying a very slow death, but all we could do was put him on the floor to die slowly. His whole family has been killed, so he was alone. The bottom of the picture is Aya, who's actually the sister of the boy on the trolley. She was 8, she didn't have a fatal injury, she had a bad fractured leg, which was very displaced. When you've got a displaced fractured leg, it kinks the blood vessels, so it stops blood getting to the foot. So you need to straighten the leg rapidly in order to save that leg. This was a day we had no morphine at all in Al-Aqsa Hospital. No strong painkillers. So our orthopaedic colleague came down, had to straighten that girl's leg with no pain relief. And I can still hear in my ears the screams as that happened. 3 hours later, another load of victims, bomb victims came in, including an 8-year-old girl who had terrible burns. I didn't treat her. My friend Debbie Harrington treated her. She had burns that were so bad you could see the bones of her face through the flesh. There was no chance of survival. She wouldn't have survived in Oxford, in London, anywhere in the world. She had fatal injuries anywhere. So all we could do was try and palliate her, try and let her die peacefully. This was the day, remember, we had no morphine in the hospital at all, so we couldn't give her any pain relief, and there was nowhere for her to die peacefully. So she was lying on the floor in a corner of the waiting area of ED, dying in agony, alone. And again, there are many examples. So I spent most of my time that first trip operating. So I'm a surgeon, I'm a cancer surgeon in Oxford, but I do general surgery, abdominal and chest surgery. We spent the whole time operating on appalling blast injuries to the chest and the abdomen. I've never been in a war zone before. I actually learned a lot in the first few days from the local surgeons, and then we actually helped them with a lot of the more complicated injuries. But shrapnel, often only 2 or 3 millimeters wide, can cause the most appalling damage as it goes into the abdomen and the chest, tearing through the internal organs, often very, very sick. So I'm there with Khaled Damas, a great friend of mine, who Tayeb knows as well, and we spent all our time doing that. This was a typical scene. Patient comes in extremis, bleeding to death. They're in their clothes, the clothes get dumped on the ground. We operate, there's blood all over the floor, and then the operating theatre after the case looks like that. And that was a very, very standard day in the operating theatre. But often, we know there's no electricity, often no fuel. We know Al-Aqsa Hospital has run out of fuel twice in the last 2 or 3 weeks. When hospitals run out of fuel, they can't ventilate patients. And at Sheep Hospital, there are many examples of patients on ventilators dying because they couldn't be ventilated. You will have heard about the babies at Nasser Hospital who were in incubators, who died because there was no fuel to keep the incubators going. Their dead bodies were discovered, rotting several weeks later. Often no theatre lights. We didn't have this problem, but I know surgeons, friends of mine, who had to operate using the light from a mobile phone sometimes. Often no drugs, often no blood products, limited surgical instruments. We often ran out of surgical gloves or surgical dressings or sterile. I could go on and on and on. Very, very challenging circumstances. There were thousands living in Al-Aqsa Hospital. At one point in Shifa Hospital, we know in October, before it was destroyed for the first time, there were 70,000 people living in the hospital and its grounds. In Al-Aqsa Hospital, a much, much smaller hospital, there were between 20 and 30,000 living in the hospital, in the grounds, or the immediate streets round about. I've never seen crowding like that. Every single square foot had patients or their relatives. Al-Aqsa is a small hospital. It normally has about 150 patients. It had 850 patients when we were there. This is Zeki. This is a little boy who had been living in the hospital for 7 months. All his family killed. No living family at all. Al Jazeera did a mini documentary about him, the interview, because he actually got used to helping the paramedics. He'd go to the ambulances when they came into the ED. He'd help transport the patients in. He used to help us with everything. We all got to know him very well. He's got no life outside, and there are many children like him, multiple displacements, many orphans. Let me tell you a bit about Shifa Hospital. Shifa Hospital was an iconic hospital. The major trauma centre, the biggest hospital in Gaza. It's older than the Israeli state. It's 78 years of age. A wonderful hospital. I've worked there, I've taught there, I've operated there. Was a truly great hospital. This is Al Shifa Hospital now. It's been completely destroyed for the second time, but completely now. When the Israeli soldiers left Shifa Hospital, they found 300 Palestinian dead civilians in the grounds of the hospital, many of them with their hands hanged up behind their back, including many healthcare workers. You may have read about Ahmed Akadmer, a very well-known, fairly junior, but a very well-known plastic surgeon in Gaza. I didn't know him well, but I met him when I was operating in Shifa Hospital last May. That's his mother, who was a physician in Al Shifa Hospital. In the last evacuation, they were asked to leave, and after when they left, they were both executed by the Israeli army. There are many other examples like that. What about torture? We know this is happening. On the left is Sari, an operating theatre nurse at Al-Aqsa Hospital, whom I spent every day 2 weeks working with in the operating theatre. In the middle, on the right is Shabs, a mate of mine from Nottingham who was with me, an anaesthetic assistant, and he's with Highton, who didn't want his face to be shown. He's a young doctor. Both these two were kidnapped, abducted by the Israeli army, and imprisoned and tortured daily. Sari for 45 days, Highton for 62 days. They've given me very detailed testimony of exactly what happened. They were stripped naked. They were handcuffed and blindfolded 24 hours a day for 45 and 62 days, respectively. They were beaten every single day, sometimes for up to 12 hours at a time. Dogs with muzzles were set upon them to frighten them. Many of them died. On the right is Adnan El-Bersh, who Inas will remember well, who I only met briefly last year. He was a very well-known orthopaedic surgeon in Gaza who had been abducted and imprisoned, and he died in imprisonment about 3 weeks ago. This is worth the online web addresses there at the top. Euromed Human Rights Monitor. They've taken very detailed testimonies of 100 Palestinian detainees who've been released, and they described what was happening to thousands of Palestinian civilians, because they were one of many out there, all having arbitrary detention, often for no reason at all, enforced disappearance, torture, and multiple examples of inhuman and cruel treatment, as I've described as well. So there are many very clear examples. I'm going to talk a bit about deconfliction. Deconfliction doesn't work. Deconfliction is the process which the Israelis have shown can work in the past. It's the process by which humanitarian workers, medics, healthcare workers, aid workers can come in and be protected in order to provide the aid they want to provide. And we have a system, when I say we, MAP, the local staff, about whom I spoke earlier, that magnificent group of people, every evening would be on the phone to Kogat, which is the liaison branch of the Israeli army, to be sure which roads, which hospitals, which areas were deconflicted, so that we could hopefully go safely to the hospital, work safely in the hospital, in order to do our jobs. And we get these maps every day. The red circles are where the Israeli ground forces are. The blue circles are where they aren't. You'll remember the whole of Gaza was divided up into a grid system with numbered grids, and we'd see those red circles get ever closer to where we were living and to where the hospital. We all know what happened with the Grand Central Kitchen. It was at night, but 3 vehicles with aid workers killed. You'll all remember that. But we witnessed as well. This is our actual hospital intensive care unit. On Friday, January the 5th, we were meant to be leaving Al-Aqsa on the Sunday the 7th, but on the January the 5th, on the Friday, I was operating for about 5 hours on a young 19-year-old woman who had terrible blast injuries to her chest and abdomen. I finished operating at about 20 to 3, came out of the operating theatre to find panic throughout the whole hospital. Now, we hear bombs going off all the time there, so hearing another explosion is nothing. You hear it non-stop. What I hadn't realised was that missile attack had been on the intensive care unit, the next building to where I was operating. That was the hole in the wall from the missile attack. That led to us rapidly being evacuated from the hospital. MSF were there as well, they had to evacuate. When the foreign doctors leave, the local doctors leave as well. So that hospital overnight became disabled for about 2 weeks. It's the only hospital in Deir al-Balah. This is the house I was living in Al-Mawasi. We know Al-Mawasi, don't we? It's what the Israelis call the safe area. Well, it's not that safe. We left on January the 9th. Another team from the UK, and that team went in, including friends of mine. And a week later, they were asleep in that house with some Gazan friends. An F-16 jet bombed it with bombs, obviously, that had come from America. The Israeli army targeted that house, which was inhabited by several foreign doctors and local Gaza workers as well. No one killed miraculously. Injuries had to be evacuated straight away. Our government, I went and spoke to Cameron about this. Our government spoke to the Israeli government, and Cameron told me that the first response from the Israeli government was that, well, we're very sorry, but we were targeting the house next door, which was full of Hamas militants. That house is 200 metres away from the nearest building. That's why it was chosen to be a safe house. They gave subsequently 6 other excuses to why they bombed a house full of UK doctors, all of them conflicting, all of them not remotely present. So I'm going to talk a little bit about malnutrition, and I'm going to hand over time. I've probably extended over my time, so I apologise for this. So I want to talk about famine, malnutrition, because I think this is the biggest problem affecting Gaza at the moment. We know you'll be familiar with the IPC report from a few weeks ago designating northern Gaza as in danger of imminent famine, but also talking about middle Gaza and southern Gaza as having severe malnutrition. And it's something we highlighted when we got out of Gaza in January. We spoke about it because we could see the beginnings of it at that time. And my trip recently, and I've returned about 3 or 4 weeks ago, we saw the most appalling impact of malnutrition. I will talk a bit about that. There is a famine in northern Gaza. There's a famine imminent in middle Gaza and southern Gaza, which is clearly being exacerbated by what's happening in Rafah. It's a man-made famine. Let's not forget that. And we may be familiar with a statement from a senior UN human rights official who said very clearly starvation is being used as a method of war, which of course is the charge that the ICC, to their great credit, has laid against Netanyahu and his colleagues. And there is a wealth of evidence that has been given to the ICC and will be given to the ICC to support that charge. So again, health warning, apologise for the pictures. They're pretty horrible, but these are the cases we have to deal with. Malnutrition is not just about losing weight. When you have had a severe injury, or when you're having major surgery, malnutrition will cause this vicious cycle of events. It leads to immunosuppression. It leads to very, very poor tissue healing. The wounds don't heal, so your abdominal wound will open. That's what happened to that patient who was a patient of mine. The abdominal wall disintegrated. The intestinal repairs, the repairs of the liver, the repairs of the pancreas, the repairs of the duodenum, fall to pieces. They disintegrate. So bowel contents leak out and can't be controlled. They cause terrible infections. That increases the metabolic demand of the body, which increases the malnutrition, and you get this vicious cycle. So this is going to be becoming the major cause of death there. And again, I'm going to tell you about 2 individuals. And again, I apologise. I've got permission from Lama's family to show this photo, and indeed from her, before she died. So Tara, I'm going to photograph of Tara. Tala was a 16-year-old female. Lama was an 18-year-old female. Both patients of mine, both had blast injuries, sustaining damage to their intestines. Both of them had very, very clearly survivable injuries if they hadn't been malnourished to start with. Both of them were extremely malnourished. Both of them died whilst we were looking after them. That's Lama there. She's very swollen, as you can see, from malnutrition. 18-year-old girl, a whole life ahead of her. That's her abdominal wound. And again, it's not very nice to look at. She had a stoma, but every hole you can see there, feces was pouring out of it. Her abdominal wound, feces was pouring out of it. Her drain site, we had to construct these bags to try and control it. She died the day we left Gaza. A few weeks ago, the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, in conjunction with Johns Hopkins, wrote a paper modelling the potential deaths in Gaza from excess deaths if the war continued, if the military assault. Now, we became very familiar with the term of excess deaths during COVID, didn't we? Deaths not due to trauma, that was not due to COVID. These are deaths not due to trauma, due to other things. No cancer treatment, very poor diabetes treatment, very poor kidney failure treatment, very poor infectious diseases treatment, very poor heart treatment. Malnutrition will make that all much worse. And they estimated that if there's a continuing escalation of the war, which there is because of what's happening in Rafah and the renewed assaults in northern Gaza as well, they predicted the excess deaths will get to 100,000 and might even get to 250,000, dwarfing the number of deaths we're seeing from trauma. And when I wrote this slide a few weeks ago, I said that Rafah invasion would be apocalyptic, and of course it is. This is a picture I took on May the 6th. On the left, as we left Rafah, we were the last people to get through the crossing before the Israeli army invaded it. They had issued evacuation order that morning. As we drove through Rafah, you can see we saw hundreds of people leaving, not their homes, because they weren't homes. They were temporary shelters. They were tents. They were man-made tents. They were tarpaulin coverings, to which they'd been displaced on many occasions already. And they were evacuating very rapidly. Cars walking on carts pulled by donkeys. On the left, you can see all the smoke. We left bombs going off all around the crossing. We were the last people to get out, then the Israeli tanks took over the crossing. And the MAP staff, those heroes I told you about earlier, I've spoken to them the day afterwards. The officials who had processed our exit at the last minute were all murdered 3 hours later by the Israeli army who went in there. You may know no Western journalists at all have been allowed into Gaza, excepting 1 or 2 Poland journalists who went in with the Israeli army to northern Gaza. We won't name. This is Hind, who's a very well-known Gazan journalist, not quite as well known as Motaz, who's a close friend who's left Gaza now, but Hind nevertheless. She's the cousin of Sarah al-Saka, who's a very close friend of mine, and I got to know him very well in my last trip. These are just excerpts from her Twitter feed since May the 6th. A new Israeli massacre as the Israeli warplanes target the displaced tents in the Al-Mawasi area west of Rafah City again, bombing tents, makeshift shelters full of women and children. I have a live hit on Al Jazeera in the case, and all I'm thinking about is how I'll report this on this massive hit. My heart is pounding so fast, my fingers are shaking, I want to cry. We are literally trapped. So, my penultimate slide. What must we do? These are not my words, these are the words of the great Hussam Zomrot, who is the ambassador from Palestine to the UK. And Tyler and I were with him at an event 2 weeks ago. This is from his speech of that night. This is what he said the world needs to do. An immediate and permanent ceasefire. Start yesterday the process of reconstruction, rebuilding and providing humanitarian aid. Accountability. The war criminals must be held to account. And we're going to hear from Tyler about this in a minute. And sanctions. Arms embargo, of course. But all those complicit companies who profit, there must be sanctions. And these are my words, but I think we all believe this. Whether we're individuals, whether we are institutions, academic institutions, healthcare institutions in the United Kingdom, whether we're government, whether we're society, we are all going to be defined by how we react to events in Gaza. So I'm going to finish by get your cameras out, QR code for MAP, donate money to if they need it. There is incontrovertible evidence, in my view, incontrovertible evidence that healthcare facilities are being directly targeted, incontrovertible evidence, in my view, that healthcare workers are being directly targeted, abducted, tortured, and killed. The healthcare system has been almost completely disabled, and I do not believe there are any properly functioning hospitals, and barely one or two partly functional. And the biggest concern now is that malnutrition has already set in. This is not something that can be treated with food. This is something that needs acute inpatient medical care, and there are no acute inpatient beds left. So there'll be many, many excess deaths due to malnutrition. I apologise, I've overrun, but thank you very much for listening.
Sarah. Every single person. In a sense, you need a few minutes of silence. And just absorb the gravity of the situation. I'm not going to say more than that.